بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I thank the brothers and sisters at the mosque here for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to come here, and I hope it's the second of many visits, inshallah ta'ala. I'm also very pleased to see the way the committee handled the incident. I actually saw him coming in, I thought he wanted to accept Islam.
Inshallah one day.
Inshallah one day. And I think it's a beautiful example of the balance of being kind and respectful in dealing with people, at the same time being assertive. Because don't ever think that you have any less right to be here, to express yourself, to be part of the community than anyone else. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was in Mecca, he was tortured, and his companions, some of them were tortured and even killed. And the Prophet ﷺ never reduced the veracity of his message, the confidence of his message. In fact, once the Prophet ﷺ was reclining against the Kaaba with his back against the Kaaba, and some of the companions were being tortured in the distance, and he could hear their screams. So another companion became a little bit frustrated and came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "Won't you please make dua for us? It's a reasonable request." And the Prophet ﷺ told him off and said, "From the people before you were people whose skin was combed off with metal combs, and they were sawed in half, and it did not deflect them from Islam." And the Prophet ﷺ told of a time in the future when Islam would be so widespread and peace and security would be so widespread, a woman could travel from one end of the Arabian Peninsula to another. He mentioned 2 parts, without any fear. The Prophet ﷺ told the companion off. Why? Show no signs of weakness or vulnerability. Complete confidence, complete trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the same time, the Prophet ﷺ was respectful, diplomatic. Last week we were covering Hadith Jibreel alayhi salam. It's known as Hadith Jibreel. It's a very fundamental hadith in Islam. It describes the basics of Islam, Iman and Ihsan. And it was a little bit technical. So today we're going to take a really practical example. But before that, I just want to contextualize by recapping what we covered last week. Hadith Jibreel is a very famous hadith, quite a long hadith, where Jibreel alayhi salam, the angel Gabriel, came in the form of a man and sat with the Prophet ﷺ and the companions and questioned the Prophet ﷺ in order to teach the companions, which shows us that questioning and dialogue is one of the most effective ways of learning. And we learnt also a number of points of what we call tarbiyah, or teaching and learning, nurturing, developing, educating from this hadith. You see, learn to look beyond the surface of what's said. When you're reading verses of the Quran, when you're reflecting on hadith, go beyond the surface. The fact that Jibreel came and sat with the Prophet ﷺ, he put his knees against the knees of the Prophet ﷺ and put his hands on the thighs of the Prophet ﷺ. This is very alien to our culture, isn't it? When you go into a class to learn from the teacher, what do? You go to the back of the class. Young ones know what I'm talking about. To mess around and poke fun at the teacher. That's not the Islamic way. To learn from a teacher, you have to be close to that teacher. You have to be so respectful of that teacher. And you have to spend quality time with that teacher. We've become a very bite-sized kind of time community, online courses, 1-hour lessons. That's not like the companions. Reflect on the fact the companions were sitting with the Prophet ﷺ, always sitting with the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ is not always lecturing them, but they're spending quality time with the Prophet ﷺ to learn from him. And Jibreel came so close to the Prophet ﷺ, he's actually touching him. And look at the questioning, the dialogue, the interaction. The Prophet ﷺ could just say to the companions, right, today I'm going to tell you about Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. There are 3 levels, they're like concentric circles. Islam means this, Iman means this, Ihsan means this. He could have just done a kind of short speech and it would have been done. But look how dynamic the way of learning is. Jibreel comes, he questions the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ answers, Jibreel says, that's correct. The companions are amazed. How comes he's asking a question and then answering, yes, you're correct? Normally if you ask a question, it means you don't know the answer. Very dynamic way of learning. Very organic way of learning. And these are just some of the kind of secondary aspects or below the surface aspects which we learn from this hadith. In this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ summarized Islam, Iman and Ihsan. The Prophet ﷺ described Islam as the 5 pillars of Islam: Shahadati an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah wa iqam as-salah wa ita'i az-zakah wa hajj al-bayt wa sawmi Ramadan. To testify that there is no true God deserving of worship except Allah, to establish Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, to establish the prayers, to pay the zakah, to fast Ramadan, and to make the pilgrimage. The 5 pillars of Islam. It's actually in another hadith they're described as the 5 pillars. In this, the Prophet ﷺ just lists them. Now, how did we summarize last week? Can anybody remember? That Islam, how did we summarize these 5 pillars of Islam? Anybody remember the kind of words we described? Any ideas? Somebody who was here last week?
Then we further on discussed about the Iman, what are the 4 pillars of the Iman.
What about Islam? How did we describe it?
Is it the outwardly actions?
Yes, the outward actions, the outward submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the testifying, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, saying something, physically praying, giving your money in zakah, fasting Ramadan, a physical action, making pilgrimage, a physical action. These are the outward physical acts of submission. And that's what Islam means. People often say Islam means peace. That's not quite very accurate. It means peace, but it means something more than just peace. It means the peaceful submission. Submission. We belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Something people find very hard to come to terms with. Especially in a society where freedom, liberty is, such a high moral value, which it is. But the idea that you belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you must submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then we mentioned the 6 pillars of Iman. Iman, belief in Allah, in the Day of Judgment, in the divinely revealed books, in the angels, in the messengers, and in divine decree. How did we kind of collectively describe Iman? Islam was the outward acts of submission. So what is Iman?
Inward submission.
Yeah, inward beliefs, inward submission. So the religion is very comprehensive. Outwardly, physically, you have to perform acts of worship. Inwardly, you have to submit and have the right beliefs. And there was a little bit of a technical discussion which I wanted to mention last week, which I did, that when Islam is mentioned alone, it actually includes Islam and Iman. When Iman is mentioned alone, it actually includes Islam and Iman. They're synonymous terms. They can be used interchangeably. But when they're both mentioned together, they mean distinctly separate things, like this hadith. It's something you have to get used to with Islamic kind of terminology. So when Islam is mentioned alone, it means Islam, the outward submission, and the inward submission. When Iman is mentioned alone, it means the outward submission and the inward submission. But when they're both mentioned together in the same context, Islam means the outward submission, Iman means the inward submission. And then we spoke about Ihsan. أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم يكن تراه فإنه يراك. That you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you can see Him. And if you cannot see Him, then He can see you.